The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/SBO. Terms and conditions apply.
Amateur Traveler, episode 901. Today, Amateur Traveler talks about Roman and Greek ruins, mosques, churches, and fortresses, Alexander the Great, Mother Teresa, and Skanderbeg, as we go to Albania, North Macedonia, and Kosovo. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about the Balkans. I'd like to welcome back to the show Justin Barnes, who's come to talk to us about a trip in the Balkans. Justin, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. It's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
And I say welcome back. We've done shows on the Canary Islands and on Turkmenistan.
And the Big Island and Fiji.
Fiji, that's right. That was the most recent one. Excellent. But you did a trip this time to the Balkans. What is your connection with the Balkans, first of all?
I didn't have any connection until a tour that we took last month. I was always interested in the area because of it being a crossroads of the East and West, but I candidly didn't know much. I could have used an Amateur Traveler podcast giving me some good info.
We've got some episodes on the Balkans, I'm pretty sure, but we'll have one more.
I did listen to them, and that was actually one of the reasons I reached out. The one on Northern Macedonia was a bit dated, and the one on Albania went to some different places than where we traveled. So I thought this might be helpful.
Excellent. Well, why should someone go to the Balkans?
Like I said, it's a fascinating intersection of the East and West. It's been shaped by history over many different iterations, from the Greeks to the Illyrians to the Byzantines to the Ottomans. And whenever you have a place like that's been shaped by so many different cultures and with such a fascinating history, you see a lot of things you don't really see elsewhere on the globe. In addition, it's very inexpensive. The places that I'm going to be talking about, Albania and North Macedonia, are much less expensive than even other places in the Balkans, let alone the rest of Europe. The area was much more green and lush than I was expecting. I don't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't expecting beautiful green forests everywhere. And the cities that we went to, pretty much everything was walkable, aside from the time that it takes to get from one city to the next. Once you're actually where you need to be, you can walk around. The weather's good. The people are nice. I always felt safe. There's a lot to offer.
Excellent. And what itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
Like I said, we were on a group trip, and so I'm going to talk about what we did.
Which is unusual for you.
Yes. Yeah, I believe this might have been the first one we did. So I think, though, what I'd recommend is something similar to what we did, but maybe with a little bit more time in a couple of the places where I wish we would have had more time had we not been on a group trip. But if you're looking at a map, you're going south through Albania from the border with Montenegro down most of the way south, and then heading back northeast up through Albania and then into North Macedonia up to Skopje, and then round it out with Kosovo, which is right across the border from Skopje, which is very close to the border with Kosovo.
Excellent. Which may or may not be a country, depending on who you ask.
Yes, I think entering from Skopje is probably the border crossing you want to do.
Okay.
So I'm going to start in northern Albania. I think I mentioned the Illyrians when I was talking about the history. The Illyrians I knew nothing about prior to this trip, but I guess they were a large group of people that was more like the Vikings in that there wasn't a central government, so to speak, but just a lot of affiliated tribes that were all up and down the Adriatic Sea, the eastern coastline of the Adriatic. And one of the tribes was called the Albani. And fast forward about 2,000 years, and you have the country of Albania, which is named for that tribe. So the first place I'd like to start is in Skodra, which is right by the Montenegrin border. We had come in overland from Montenegro. Somebody coming in on this trip almost assuredly fly into one of three places. You'd fly into Tirana, the capital of Albania, Ohrid, which is a lake that's on the border of the Albania and North Macedonia, or Skopje. And if you're coming from the US, you're almost assuredly going to have to stop somewhere in Europe, probably like Zurich or Frankfurt, Vienna, or I think a couple of people in our group went through Istanbul. If you have the choice, I would recommend spending one night either on the front end or the back end in Vienna for reasons that will make sense here in about 15 or 20 minutes, because it has a nice tie to some of the things that we're going to be discussing. But so back to Skodra, it was a town that I'm not sure you would necessarily go to if you were flying into Tirana, because of the opposite direction from everything else that I'm going to talk about. But there was one thing there that was very unexpected, delight. There was a huge factory and shop for Venetian carnival masks. I can only assume it's lower cost or something, but there were hundreds, if not thousands, of masks available for sale. And we saw the factory where they were making it. Didn't smell great in there, but it was really fascinating to see how the masks were made.
That is not something I would have expected to find in Albania.
Yeah, no, not at all. So that was a nice small town. There was a nice pedestrian area where everyone grabbed lunch, but there was not a ton to see in Skodra. Like I said, it was nice. The next place we went after that was called Kruje, Kruje. It's only 20 miles or so north of Tirana. So if you were in Tirana, Kruje would be a very easy day trip where you wouldn't have to switch hotels. It's up in the hills overlooking the valley that has Tirana in it. And the main thing there is the Castriati Museum. George Castriati, aka Skanderbeg, was a famous Albanian. He led a rebellion against the Ottomans in the 1460s, carved out a small area for the Albanians in the middle of the Ottoman Empire, and held on to it for several decades, constantly fighting off the Ottomans, which made him a folk hero, so to speak, in the country. And his statue is everywhere around the country. And his helmet is famous as well. It had I think it was like a bronze top shaped like a goat with horns on it. And that was on top of his helmet. And somehow, some way, that helmet has ended up in the Welt Museum in Vienna, Austria. So after we saw all this stuff, we just by happenstance had a night in Vienna. And so when we were in Vienna, we went to see the helmet, and it is pretty cool to see. It definitely does not look like other helmets I've seen over the years. So in the museum in Kruje, obviously the helmet is not there, but there's a lot of other artifacts and information about Skanderbeg, a lot of information on him, the history of Albania, and that sort of thing. And the views from up there, like I said, are incredible. Also in Kruje, there's a small bazaar where you can do a lot of shopping. The prices tended to be lower than they were in the major cities. And it was like a cute little town to walk through. And like I said, it's only 20 miles or so north of Tirana. On the drive between Kruje and Tirana, another unexpected thing we saw on the same day that we saw the Venetian mask factory, there's a large statue of George W. Bush in the town of, I think it was Fusha Kruje or something to that effect. I guess he visited the country when he was in office and for some reason decided to stop off in this small little town, grabbed some coffee and some pastries somewhere. And so now that's the town's claim to fame, and they put up a statue of him in one of the squares in the middle of town. So yeah, that was an unexpected surprise.
That's funny.
So then next would be Tirana, which, like I said, is the capital of Albania. I was surprised to hear it's a relatively new city. There wasn't much of anything there till around 100 years ago. It really got built up between World War I and World War II. Prior to that, the capital had been in Durrës, which is a coastal city to the west. Then, after World War II, Albania was behind the Iron Curtain, and it was very isolated, not only from the West, but even from the Soviets and pretty much the rest of the world. It was akin to what North Korea is like now. It was just people didn't really know much about it, and the people in Albania didn't know much about what was going on outside the world. Our guide, who was born, I believe, in the 70s, said he was 16 years old when he found out the Beatles existed. He just had no idea, which was just mind-blowing to hear. But any building over 6 stories that's in Tirana was built since 1989. So the city is largely brand new. To our surprise, there was a lot of very interesting and funky architecture, like what you'd see maybe in, I don't know, Azerbaijan or Shanghai or Ashgabat or something like that, with a lot of interesting colors and shapes. And I was not expecting to see that in Albania. There's a huge main drag that runs north-south through town that was built in, I think, the 1920s or 1930s with assistance from the Italians. This is when the fascist government was in Italy. And I think they were planning to recreate the ancient Roman Empire. So I think there were ulterior motives why they were helping Albania. But basically, they built this huge road before the city had anything there. And they called it the Boulevard Without a City. Now there's a city there. There's a lot of traffic everywhere. There's no trams or subways, but at least it's easy to walk around. At the end of the street, there is what's now a university place for faculty members, but it was built 100 years ago to be a place where fascist leaders could give speeches to thousands of people in the square below. There's actually a balcony where it was intended for Mussolini to give some speeches that never came to fruition, but the balcony is still there and probably now is the office building for some engineering professor, which I find a little humorous. So some of the sites in Tirana, like I said, there's the view from the end of that street that looks back towards this massive square that could easily fit tens of thousands of people in it. It's called Skanderbeg Square. And in the square, there's a huge statue of Skanderbeg riding a horse. Along the way, in between the square and the end of the street, there's what they call the Tirana Pyramid, which was supposed to be a museum for the former leader, Enver Hoxha. But when he died and the wall fell and everyone realized that they'd been misled for all those decades, the people almost burned it to the ground, and then it became an underground ruin bar kind of thing, like you in a couple of places in Budapest. And they were going to destroy it to build a new parliament building there, but the city rallied together because they viewed it as a symbol of hope and rebirth. So now it's an area for youth groups to meet, and there's art installations there, and there's steps on the outside of the pyramid that lead up to the top where there's good views all around the city and into the mountains in the distance. Also in Tirana, there is this thing called bunk art. During the Cold War era, there were bunkers built everywhere across Albania.
Right.
And one of these, where they have bunk art, was one that Hoxha had built for himself in case it was necessary. And nobody knew it existed, 1989, 1990, something like that. And now it has been turned into a museum with a lot of information about what life was like during the Cold War era. Some of the rooms are as they had been put together way back when. I think there was one room that had a red toilet, which seemed awfully random. But yeah, so that was an interesting thing to see. And right near bunk art is a tramway, a funicular that goes up, I think, for 20 minutes. It was a long ride up to Dashti Mountain. I think it was Dajti.
Hmm.
And that has incredible views over the city and, in fact, all the way to the Adriatic. And there's places to have lunch or coffee or drinks or whatever. There's a couple playgrounds up there. So that's a kind of a nice change of pace. The weather was a little cooler up there. That reminds me, the weather was 70s everywhere we were on this trip. Like I said, we went in May,
Okay.
and most people recommend to go in either April, May, or September, October. My guess is it would be more green during April, May, and probably a little bit less likelihood of rain in September, October. But one thing that I didn't think of that our guide mentioned is in May, you're going to have a lot more hours of daylight than you would have in September, October. If I was recommending this for somebody, I would say May, because one of my favorite things to do during this trip was to go on walks in the morning before meeting up with the group. You can walk around all these cities in the early morning. The sun's up at 5 a.m. And it's nice seeing the city when it's quiet. There's not honking car horns and that sort of thing. I went in May. I think I definitely recommend May. So then the next place on the itinerary is Durrës, which, like I said, is just west of Tirana. There's no real border between the two. They just blend from one into the other.
Konnichiwa, I'm Yuki, a tour leader with Explore. Who knew that hidden among Tokyo's towering skyscrapers was a peaceful tea house surrounded by ancient trees and serene ponds? Actually, I knew. It was my mother's secret sanctuary. Not everyone knows about Tokyo's Hamarikyu Gardens. ありがとうございます. But you will if you explore. Search exploreworldwide.com and don't just travel, explore.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
Durrës, if I had to describe it, it's like some of those coastal towns in Orange County, like Newport Beach, Laguna Beach, Huntington, that sort of area where it's not that big. There's nice promenades along the water, beautiful ocean, lots of pubs and cafes and coffee houses near the water, good weather. Everyone's just out and about enjoying outdoor life.
And when you say near the water, so we're on the Adriatic at this point.
Yes, and in fact, I think you're probably only maybe 125 miles from Italy. There's actually ferries that go back and forth between Durrës and I think the town in Italy is Bari, but basically
Puglia.
the boot part of Italy is just right there. The main difference, the claim to fame of Durrës, is there's a Roman amphitheater that's there right near the water. It was covered up during the Ottoman period and only recently uncovered. They're still in the process of excavating it and also in the process of creating a pathway between the amphitheater and the new coastal promenade. It's supposed to be done soon, theoretically. I don't know what soon means, but when it's done, I think it would be even more impressive than it was when we were there. And Durrës is one of the places where I wish we could have spent more time because, like I said, it's a very beautiful place right there on the Adriatic. It would be nice to have spent a night or two there and gone in the water a little bit, walked up and down the promenade for a little longer. But on our tour, we just didn't have time for that because we went to the next place I'm going to talk about, which is Apollonia, which is a Greek ruin about an hour or two south of Durrës near the town of Fieri. We were out in the middle of nowhere. There were goats and donkeys that we saw on the road as we were approaching Apollonia. But then all of a sudden, out of the middle of nowhere, you just see this ruin area with some areas still looking fairly intact, marble columns like you'd see at the Parthenon or something like that. Obviously not that big, but for being out in the middle of nowhere, it was very cool to see. And there was lots of walking paths around where you could meander around and through everything. I don't remember much of anything being behind fences, so you could just walk right up to everything and look at the inscriptions in the marble. There was also a small museum there that had a lot of artifacts going back thousands of years. A small church, St. Mary's Church, And this, again, would be something that would be very easy to do as a day trip from either Durrës or from Tirana. It's not that far from either one. I think it's probably worthwhile for maybe 2 to 3 hours, maybe a morning or an afternoon, something like that. The next place we went was about an hour and a half northeast of there to a town called Berat, which has a castle complex on the hill above the town. And this is a UNESCO site. It's been destroyed and rebuilt several times over the millennia. Ironically, the Romans destroyed it when it was part of the Illyrian Empire, and then it was later rebuilt and reinforced when it was part of the Roman Empire. So they both destroyed it and then strengthened it a couple centuries later. And you could walk around all in there. There was a cathedral, famous cathedral full of icons with just very ornate, intricately carved wood. I think it was walnut that was all around the icons. The wood was carved in 3D. I have a hard time figuring out how to describe it. The best analogy I can think of is imagine like trying to carve a DNA double helix out of a tree trunk, like that sort of work where it's not only carved on the front, but also like front to back as well. It's the sort of thing that they really can't even recreate now, even with the equipment they have. I think just because the wood's not as good as it used to be, maybe because of pollution, I'm not sure. But yeah, so the Cathedral of the Assumption of St. Mary is that church. And it's, like I said, at the castle complex on a hill right above Berat. The views over Berat are very nice. It's in a valley with a river running through it. And then all around 360 degrees, there's taller hills that are there that were green, very green when we were there. You can actually walk down from the castle complex into town. It doesn't take that long. Further down the hill, right when you're getting down into the valley, there's a couple things that we saw. One was a mosque called the King Mosque, built in the 1400s, with incredibly colorful and ornate ceilings, lots of bright colors like bright reds, greens, and yellows on the ceiling. There was an old caravanserai that was there. Right next door, there was a dervish building called, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but Halbeti Teka or Teki, that also had very ornate ceilings and some sort of stained glass. I don't quite know how to describe it, but brightly colored glass in these ornate coverings over the windows. Very impressive. Like I said, the mosque, the dervish building, and the caravanserai are all at the eastern base of the hill that has the castle complex. And on the hillside in between those is a neighborhood called the Mangalima neighborhood that's quite old, with narrow cobblestone streets and lots of Airbnbs and small hotels. We didn't stay there, but I walked through it one morning when I was walking around town, and if I was going back myself, I would probably stay in the neighborhood because it just seemed like you were going back in time a little bit, and it was a lot quieter up there. There's very nice walking paths along the riverbank, both banks of the river in the early morning. There's a nice pedestrian street full of restaurants and bars going right through the middle of Berat, some of which took credit cards, although many didn't. And that reminds me, that was one of the things I wanted to update, is a lot of the places that we went, especially in the cities, did take credit cards.
Okay.
The further you got outside of a city, the less likely it was. The other thing is if you needed cash in many of the places, but not all, let's say 2/3, just to give a number, you could use euros. Because for us, this was part of a tour where we went to 7 countries. And so we didn't want 7 different sets of currency. So it was nice to go somewhere that took either credit cards or euros. So one thing I would recommend is if you're looking for a restaurant or a bar or a cafe, look at the reviews on either TripAdvisor or Google and just see if there's anything indicating whether the place you're thinking of going takes credit cards. And if not, if it takes euros, because that will save you the need to go to the ATM or the need to exchange money somewhere. Another thing that's more of a general point, not specific to Berat, but Berat was the first place where we really started to notice this, is There's stray dogs everywhere. They're very well behaved. They seem to all be fixed and tagged. They have got like little tags on their ears, so you can tell that they've been fixed. And all of the restaurants gave us entirely too much food. If you ordered one dish for 2 people, you would probably still have leftovers. So what we started doing was just taking our leftovers with us and using them to feed the pups so that the food didn't go to waste. So that's it for Berat. And I guess Berat was the last place we were in Albania. So now I'm going to move to Macedonia, unless you had any questions about Albania before I move on.
No, let's keep going.
Okay. So the drive between Berat and Ohrid, which is the city on the Macedonian side of Lake Ohrid, that drive was incredibly scenic. It reminded me of Tuscany, but even greener. It's near the same latitude, but because the mountains are higher in the Balkans than they are in Italy, there's even more rain. Yeah, just imagine those rolling hillsides, but almost fluorescent green. And right at the border, since this was back in the day, the Albania-Yugoslavia border, there were bunkers everywhere. So you could just see all these little concrete bunkers and then just cows grazing on the grass, which was quite the dichotomy there. So like I said, Lake Ohrid is shared by Albania and North Macedonia. About 2/3 of the coastline is in North Macedonia. The lake is quite large, about 140 square miles. We were trying to think of what it reminded us of, and the closest we came up with was Lake Atitlan in Guatemala, because it was just an incredibly gorgeous lake with mountains all around it. In this case, mountains, not volcanoes. And a lot of different towns, some bigger and some smaller. So depending on what sort of vibe you were looking for, you could choose a town that sort of best fit what you were looking for. We stayed in the town of Ohrid, which is the largest town on the lake. The lake is UNESCO protected. I guess it has over 200 species found nowhere else on the planet. I assume a lot of those are fish, but I don't think they're all fish. The town of Ohrid itself, I would describe as think in your head of something a little bit bigger than Hallstatt, but a little bit smaller than Lucerne. But that very European town right on the lake with a coastal promenade with parks and restaurants and bars and just very quiet and serene. In downtown Ohrid, there was a paper-making museum and shop. There was a mosque with some nice turquoise paintings. There was a chinar tree, which I forget which species of tree it is, but it was over 1,100 years old. Now, if you looked at it from afar, it looked like a normal tree, but the closer you got, you saw how much the bottom part of the trunk was just mangled in different parts. Uphill from downtown Ohrid, there's an ancient Macedonian theater built in 200 BC. And again, this is from the Hellenistic area, not Roman. So that was pretty interesting. And above that, there's a Ohrid fortress overlooking the town with great views. Several old churches, St. Sophia, Holy Mary, Church of St. Clements in Patalemon, and last but not least, the Church of St. John the Theologian. That one had one of the better views I've seen anywhere around the globe. I was there in the early morning, and the lake was completely still. The only sounds you could hear were birds and an occasional barking dog, and there were snow-capped mountains in the distance. It was about 70 degrees. It was pretty much perfect. And everything I just mentioned that you can see in Ohrid is all within a 30 to 40-minute walk of everything else. It's very compact. One thing of note is the town had a bunch of Yugos, which I had not seen in 30 to 40 years.
It has been a while, yeah.
Yeah. So just south of Ohrid is the Bay of
When you
Bone.
say Yugos,
Yeah, go ahead.
we assumed right away there that people know what we're talking about. We're talking about the old car built behind the Iron Curtain in Yugoslavia.
Yes.
That burned as
in
much
the
oil
80s.
as gas, I think, is the...
Yes. Yeah. I had seen only 2 on the trip prior to Ohrid, but I probably saw at least a dozen, maybe a couple dozen when I was in Ohrid. So that was a blast from the past. Just south of the town of Ohrid is the Bay of Bones Museum, which was a 3,000-year-old settlement that they found underwater, because I guess the lake used to be lower 3,000 years ago. And I guess some divers or something found it, and they've now reconstructed the village that they found underwater to put it above water. We didn't get to go inside because we were there on a Monday, and unfortunately it was closed on Mondays, and that was the only day we were there. So obviously if you're planning to go there, go on any other day of the week. Just south of that is the St. Naum Monastery. It's just before the Albanian border. Gorgeous setting right on the lake. Inside the monastery, there was beams of light coming in through small windows near the ceiling. Really cool chandeliers, really cool artwork. And outside, they had a bunch of peacocks, including the first albino peacock I'd ever seen. So that was pretty interesting. Now moving northeast from Ohrid towards Skopje, there's a very nice stop about halfway in between called the Bygorski Monastery. It's way up in the mountains, right near the pass on the highway connecting Ohrid and Skopje, in a lush forested area, very serene, nothing else around. It was everything inside the monastery was extremely ornate, with more of that carved walnut and icons and a lot of gold in there as well. Everyone that was in our group seemed to agree that it was the most impressive of the dozens and dozens of churches we visited on our 2-week tour, both inside and out. And then about an hour and a half northeast from the Bygorski Monastery is Skopje, which is the capital of North Macedonia. And the thing that I'm going to remember the most about Skopje is there are statues everywhere. Hundreds and hundreds of statues around the town. It was part of a project, I think they called the 2014 project, to really update the city and put the architecture and the look of Yugoslavia behind and make the city look more impressive. And so a lot of the facades of the older buildings were updated to look more, I don't know, Baroque. I don't know the exact words, but that sort of look. And then the statues, and they put in a bunch of pedestrian bridges that had even more statues on them. Maybe after this podcast gets thousands, if not millions of views, they'll have a statue of you and me in town. We'll see. We'll see about that.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
This episode is brought to you by Peloton. If you're looking for flexible workouts, Peloton's got you covered. Summer runs or playoff season meditations. Whatever your vibe, Peloton has thousands of classes built to push you and has something there to adapt with you whether you need a challenge or rest. Peloton has everything you need whenever you need it. Find your push. Find your power. Peloton. Visit onepeloton.com.
But in the main square, there's a huge Alexander the Great statue. And that's just on the south side of the river that cuts through town. And then on the north side, there's a huge statue of Philip II, which was Alexander's dad. And then there's also a statue of Alexander's mom in the same area. And then, like I said, hundreds of other people who I didn't know or appreciate. So the town is, the new side is on the south and the older side is on the north side. There's a Turkish bazaar, which is the second largest and the largest outside of Istanbul. It's not like the covered market in Istanbul. It's more just a bunch of very small, close together streets with shops and cafes and whatnot.
Okay.
One morning I was out taking photos and two strangers invited me to morning tea with them. So I got to talk to a Ukrainian refugee and a North Macedonian who was translating for the two of us. So that was a not everyday experience. That was pretty cool. Also on the north side, near the bazaar, is the Skopje Fortress, which is not really maintained, but you can walk on the pathway on the top of the walls and get really good views of the city and the mountains in the distance. The weather wasn't that great for us, but I can only imagine on a clear day that it would have been a really amazing view from up there. Also on the north side of the river is the Ascension of Jesus Orthodox Church, which was interesting because it was built during the Ottoman period. And the Ottomans allowed the people to build it, but only on the condition that there was nothing tall or sticking up anywhere. So the church is basically built underground. And again, it had more of the 3D carved walnut, more of the icons. They fumigate every 5 years to keep worms from getting in and destroying the wood. I guess it's a really big deal to maintain the wood like that. Then on the south side of the river in Skopje is, like I said, the main square, which has the huge statue of Alexander the Great. There's a triumph arch that resembles the Arc de Triomphe from Paris, but not as big. And then the Mother Teresa house. She was born in Skopje.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah. So she actually ties this whole trip together that I'm talking about because she was born in Skopje, but to Kosovar Albanian parents. So all three countries have their own tie to her, but they're all very willing to share the glory, so to speak. They're not trying to hog her for themselves. So her house was destroyed during a major earthquake that destroyed much of Skopje in the 1960s. And they rebuilt the house as a museum with 2 floors. On the bottom floor, there is the museum with a lot of interesting pictures and information about her. And I'm not sure if it was a copy or the real thing, but it was a Nobel Peace Prize, which was the first time I'd seen one of those. Then upstairs, there was a small place of worship. The architectural design was very unique. I guess the architect put a lot of time and effort into designing every last little thing, and for reasons that were known to him, but other people, it's head scratching to them. I think it looks interesting. I don't know if it's a lot of people's cup of tea, but I found it interesting. Then further south from the Mother Teresa house is the old train museum, 2/3 of which was destroyed during that earthquake, and now it's just a museum. One of the things that I should have mentioned up front is this is definitely a driving tour. There's no mass transit between these cities. Fortunately, the driving is pretty easy. It's very scenic. I would personally hire a guide, a driver, for a couple of reasons. One, you want to be able to see everything as you're going between all these places because the views were quite amazing. Two, the internet, depending on your plan, could be very expensive. We were basically in airplane mode the entire time we were here. So I would recommend figuring out what cities you're going to be in and downloading offline maps before you head off. And then the other thing is, if you were able to rent a car, I'm not sure exactly how that would work with the border crossings. I don't know if you would have to pay a fee or if you'd had to turn in a car at the border and get a different one on the other side of the border. So basically what I'm saying is figure out what you want to do, but then maybe hire a driver or a guide to take you around. So then the river itself, between the north side and the south side of Skopje, like I said, there's several bridges, one of which is quite old, the stone bridge, which was built in the 1400s, that has a kind of a humorous diver statue right at the base of the bridge going into the river, with one person about to dive in and the other person whose feet are sticking up out of the water, and that's all you see. Then there's the Bridge of Art that has a couple dozen statues of famous artists from North Macedonia. And then the Bridge of Civilizations that has, in chronological order, famous Macedonians throughout history. The river's not that wide, maybe 100, 150 feet, something like that. So when you're walking back and forth over the river, it's not a big deal at all. I think I probably went over those bridges probably 10 times a day. Everything that I just discussed was all walkable, very close to one another. A little bit further afield was the Kamnik Winery. North Macedonia is known for its winemaking, and the wines we had there were uniformly excellent, both the whites and the reds. And that was before we even found out the prices. And once we found out the prices, we've been trying to figure out how to get some shipped to our place in Spain, because even if we had to pay as much to ship them as the bottle of wines cost, it would still be worth it. So last but not least, Kosovo. Kosovo is a very easy day trip from Skopje, even accounting for the border crossings. Skopje is very close to the border. And then on the north side of the border in Kosovo, there's a brand new raised highway that goes above the forested valleys, like the H3 interstate in Oahu that goes between Honolulu and Kailua. So Kosovo uses the euro. So if you do go there for a day trip, there's no need to get different money for the day. Just use the euros that you already have or use credit card. Kosovo is majority ethnic Albanian. So the Albanian that you were using a couple days prior, dust that off. And the Macedonian that you were speaking for the prior couple days, try not to use it. No one's going to get offended if you use it, but they would much prefer that you use it.
And did we pick up a lot of Albanian while we were in Albania, did we?
I do remember, I think it's parliamentary, which is thank you. I wish it was a little shorter, but it is what it is. And people do very much appreciate it if you use even just a handful of words. Mm-hmm. We've had that actually happen a couple of times where we would say thank you or please or hello or basic phrases, but a lot of people are just used to everyone speaking English, which you can. It's very easy to speak English. That's not a problem at all. But if you do use some of the local language, you get big smiles and people are very excited to talk to you. So in Kosovo, we were in Pristina, the capital, and the downtown area there had more of the Skanderbeg things, including another statue. I think he was on a horse again with his helmet. There were also statues of a lot of U.S. political leaders from the 1990s. Bill Clinton, Bob Dole, Madeleine Albright. There may have been more, but we saw at least those three. And there was also a smaller version of the Statue of Liberty and a bunch of U.S. flags all around town. So obviously the people of Kosovo or the country of Kosovo feel very indebted to the U.S. for its assistance during the war with Serbia back in the 1990s. We also saw in the downtown area of Pristina, the university library, which has participated in ugly building competitions. Apparently it is deemed to be one of the ugliest buildings in the world. You really need to look at a picture, but the best description I can give for a podcast is imagine a lot of white half icosahedrons on top of concrete blocks that are wrapped in hexagonal bars.
I'm looking at a picture and you described it well, but I still don't know if people have a mental image of this.
And the really amazing thing is this was built during the Yugoslav era. So given that a lot of the architecture was, I'll just say, muted during the Iron Curtain era, seeing this building was, it definitely
It looks to me like if chicken coops went condo.
Yeah, could be. Yeah, I could see that. The main thing that we saw, which was just a little outside of Pristina, was, apologize if I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, but it's Gazi Mestan, which was a Serbian memorial to the 1389 Battle of Kosovo. I got the impression that it was somewhat similar in meaning and significance to the Alamo in Texas, because the Serbians lost the battle in 1389. And in fact, it was losing that battle that is what led to the Ottomans sweeping in through the Balkans and heading all the way up through the Balkans, I think as far as Vienna before they got turned back.
At the Battle of Vienna,
Which ironically, or not ironically, but just interestingly, that's where croissants came from.
Right.
It was
celebrating the victory over the Ottomans, which is why they had the crescent shape.
The interesting thing is, given that this Serbian memorial is now in an area controlled by Kosovo, going there was a little problematic. It wasn't dangerous, but our guide told us that the last couple trips he came, it just wasn't open to the public. And I got the impression that it was not a heavily touristed area because you could actually walk up to the top of this monument. It was maybe 5 flights of stairs. And on the 4th or 5th flight, there was a bird nest right on one of the stairs. So I don't think a lot of people go there frequently, but it was interesting to see. And it has a lot of interesting history behind it. And the views from the top, the panoramic views were really lovely because, again, it's green everywhere and a lot of rolling hills and mountains as well. After that, you could just go right back to Skopje and spend the night there. Like I said, I would recommend maybe flying into Tirana going the route that I described and then flying out of Skopje. So when we were on this part that I described, it took us 8 nights, but I could definitely see a scenario where it could be 9, 10, 11. I would have liked to spend a night in Durrës. I could have easily spent another night in Berat. We spent only 1 night in Berat. 2 nights in Tirana seemed fine. 3 in Skopje seemed fine. If you didn't want to do the day trip to Kosovo, 2 nights in Skopje would probably be fine. It's a lot of moving around, but like I said, none of the drives are particularly long, and they're also very scenic. Hitting more places, I think, would be preferable to spending 3, 4, 5 nights in just 1 or 2 of the places that I've described.
Okay. And you did this as part of a longer tour in the Balkans with Mir, who you've talked
Correct.
about before on the podcast, because you've used them at least 3 times, although not with a group tour before.
Yeah, when I was on the Turkmenistan podcast, we had gone to the stands, Iran, with Mir. Yeah, everything was nice. I definitely recommend them. But the tour we were on, they do twice a year, once in the spring, once in the fall. So we did this as part of a longer tour where we started in Belgrade and then went to Sarajevo, Dubrovnik, and then entered Montenegro near the Bay of Kotor and spent the night in Budva. So we had actually spent the night in Budva prior to coming into Albania overland.
Excellent. Anything else people need to know before they head to this part of the Balkans?
That is a good question. I think I mentioned the offline maps is a big help as the cell phone plans may be expensive. Oh, one thing that I knew about but experiencing it was different is that in the Balkans, smoking is allowed indoors in many places.
Oh,
so
sure.
just be cognizant of that. Fortunately, if the weather's good, you can go outside and it's less of an issue. The border crossings are not too long. Like I said, I'm not sure how it would work if you had a rental car. And the food is a lot of meat, potatoes, and bread. I think if you're a vegetarian, you'd be okay, but it's not Berkeley. I'll put it that way.
Excellent. Anything else before we get to our wrap-up questions?
No.
All right. You know what's coming. You're standing in the prettiest spot in the 3 countries that we talked about today. Where are you standing? What are you looking at?
I am on Lake Ohrid, just above the Church of St. John the Theologian, looking out over the lake, the church, the snow-capped mountains, and 2 different countries. It's really amazing. I highly recommend it.
Excellent. And one thing that makes you laugh and say only in the Balkans.
This is specific to North Macedonia and Albania, but taking 50 pictures of the exact same thing because you're trying to get a photo that has the flag fully showing. Both North Macedonia and Albania have 2 of the most striking flags, and there's a lot of areas where there's huge flags on huge flagpoles. And so you'd be trying to get a picture of something, and then you realize you can't quite see the center sun on the North Macedonian flag, or you can see only one of the 2 eagles on the Albanian flag. And so you just sit there taking picture after picture, trying to get one that comes out just right. I thought it was just me, but my wife and at least 2 other people on the group all did the same thing. Yeah, that definitely is something that only in those places.
That's funny. And if you had to summarize the region in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Lush, crossroads, budding. I use budding because that was the only single word synonym I could find for up and coming. Because these areas, they really haven't had their time in the sun, so to speak, until the last 30 years. And they've been building like crazy. And I can only imagine with how lovely they are and how inexpensive they are that they're going to get more and more touristy. So I would recommend people go now while you can and have it not entirely to yourselves, but a lot less people, and they'll probably be 5, 10, 15 years from now.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Justin Barnes. And Justin, did we want to mention your website, justinandcrystal.com?
Yeah, so I put up a trip log on the website that has a description of everything we saw and did, pictures, and also some embedded videos as well. Most everything that I discussed on the podcast is on the trip log. So if you have a hard time imagining something I was trying to describe, you should be able to see a picture of it there.
Excellent. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Justin, thanks so much
Great.
for coming back on the show and talking about your love for Albania, North Macedonia, and Kosovo.
Happy to do it.
By the time this episode comes out, I'll have retired from the day job and Amateur Traveler will be my job, which is one of the reasons that I want to thank the patrons of the show who help support this show financially. And I've been saying that for a while, but now it's even more important to me. And if you're interested in learning how to become a patron of the show and what you get, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. I do want to point that Amateur Traveler also has a blog, and I point that out because I'm planning on spending more time writing the blog here as I go into whatever the heck this is, retirement or whatever. And there are posts here in the last 2 weeks about San Sebastian and Bilbao, my recent trip to Spain, and then guest posts about the real and fake in the Barcelona's Gothic Quarter, discovering Ireland's hidden gems, 10 must-see attractions, 10 things to do in London, Ontario, and then also an updated review on the best travel pants for men. So check those out on amateurtraveler.com. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.